So the question was, how do we count slaves as representatives, right? Because every state, because of how many congressmen you get, it's a big deal, right? In Congress, it shifts about power, electoral problems. So the Southerners wanted slaves to be counted as citizens. If you're a Northerner, why might you not like that?
They get more votes.
Well, only they get more votes in Congress, they also get more electoral votes, right? So you get more representation in Congress, and you get more electoral votes. Okay, but what else is a problem if you're a Northerner?
You don't like slavery.
Well,
you don't like how they're calling them citizens but not giving them rights.
you can't call these people citizens and then not extend rights to them. So they said, no, you don't, if you're going to be slaves, your property, you think they're property. Like a horse, well, you don't get to count your horses. And they said, so you can count anybody. So what was the compromise?
3/5.
Every slave was counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of representation. So, for instance, if there are 5 million slaves, that counts for 3 million people worth of representation. Another part of the slave issue was that it was agreed that 20 years from the day the Constitution was ratified, the slave trade would end. Not slavery, but bringing slaves over from Africa would end 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. And that did, although people still smuggled some slaves in. There was also a fugitive slave provision, that if slaves left and their property, then Northerners had to actually give slaves back. And so, Rahel, one thing that in America that's way different is you have not had a legacy in your history of slavery. But in America, slavery is the biggest blight on our country's history. But it's still, we still feel it today, right? Because of all kind of race relations. And it's clouded everything in history. But starting with the Constitution, going all the way through Civil Rights Movement and everything, we still feel the effects of slavery, all right? Commerce, all right? If you look at the Constitution, which we will some tomorrow, Congress can now regulate commerce. So Congress gets to decide how commerce, trade will be regulated. So for instance, we can put tariffs on goods coming in. Some people wanted us to tax stuff leaving our country, but we don't. So Congress regulates trade, and that's going to become a really big deal about 100 years from this point. All right, Congress also, and this is a big part of the Constitution with Madison, had the issue of checks and balances. What does checks and balances mean? Like, well, who's checking who? The branches, right? We're divided into 3 separate branches, right? We have a strong executive, which enforces the laws. We have Congress, which makes the laws. And we have a strong judicial branch, which interprets those laws. What's it mean to interpret? Enforcing is executive law.
For like understanding.
Yeah, you have to figure out what the laws mean. Don't laws mean different things at different times?
Yes.
We oftentimes have to interpret the Constitution based on today's society. A good example is, we'll look at the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Amendment essentially, right? What does it mean for everyone to be equal? Well, when it was written in 1868, the 14th Amendment was mostly just giving basic rights to black men, right? And then by the 1920s, they were looking at it saying, wait a minute, this applies to women too. And then by the 1950s and 60s, it applies to African Americans in a more actual, holistic, everyone's equal type of sense. Now, who are we applying the 14th Amendment to that the fact that the people who wrote it never thought about? Homosexuals, right? Gay rights, right? So today, we look at the 14th Amendment and with like gay marriage issues or just gay rights in general, and we apply our issues of equality to those. Because what we're doing is interpreting the 14th Amendment for today. The same thing can be said for the Second Amendment, like the guns thing, right? Do you think our founding fathers wanted everyone to have a semi-automatic weapon?
No.
No. Well, right, but think about this. We had a group of men who wrote this Constitution basically to try to keep the power of the mob down. Do you think they'd want your average goober to have all these weapons?
No.
Probably not. But today we have interpreted the Constitution differently and have applied it as such. Yes.
If marriage becomes illegal in all states, will they
No, probably what's happening is like gay marriage or some form of gay marriage is legal, I think, in 11 states now. And so those states actually have reinterpreted. In fact, the Supreme Court heard arguments. They struck down the Proposition 8 of California that said you couldn't have gay marriage. It was more of a technical issue than a substantial civil rights issue. But they also got rid of a law called DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, that Clinton signed in '96. Okay? And they said that law was unconstitutional, leaving open. So they interpreted the 14th Amendment to say that it was discriminatory. So now states can do it, and they probably are using the 14th Amendment as the basis. So the Supreme Court said that DOMA was unconstitutional, and the court structure, the basic court structure, you have the Supreme Court up here, right? How many people on the Supreme Court?
12.
9. There are 9 what's called justices in the Supreme Court. Tess, you should know that. All right? 9 justices on the Supreme Court. How long are you a justice for?
Life.
For life, right? Or until you retire, you don't have to be there forever. But you're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Being on the Supreme Court is a gigantic, gigantic deal. These guys or women make decisions that last for a long, long time, right? And so who's on here is a big deal. Underneath them is it's called the Federal Court of Appeals, sometimes called the Circuit Court. There are 11 circuits plus the D.C. Circuit, based on human geography, and they decide things. And on the lowest level is the Federal District Court. These are all hearing federal issues, right? Each one of these has life's terms. Presidential appointment, Senate confirmation, right? So every state has at least one district court. We have 2. Ours is basically divided by down I-75, right? To the west of Lexington is one district and there's the other. So for instance, if there's a federal issue, I mean, if Ejo stabs Bailey, that's not a federal issue, right? Federal issues mostly are not criminal issues. Most federal issues are commerce issues or constitutional issues or civil issues. There are criminal issues like child pornography. A friend of mine is actually an assistant U.S. attorney, and he prosecutes child pornography offenders and things like that. You can commit federal crimes and go through the system, but you essentially go from here to here to here. Federal Court of Appeals, 2 different Court of Appeals have struck down anti-gay marriage stuff and have interpreted the 14th Amendment as such to say that it is constitutional or it is unconstitutional to deny people the right to have marriage based on their gender specificity and they choose to love. And we'll get a lot more. You're going to learn all kinds of Supreme Court cases, but this is the basic structure of it. When there's only one body that can actually overturn a Supreme Court. You know who can overturn a Supreme Court? Kind of a trick question. Supreme Court can. The President can't overturn it. Congress can't overturn it. The only decision that can undo a Supreme Court decision is the Supreme Court. Right? So like in '54 when they integrated schools, they were actually undoing a previous Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, I saw a hand up. Tess.
So if Kentucky wanted to legalize gay marriage, we could.
Kentucky actually in 2004 passed a constitutional amendment that said it was not legal. Now, so they're literally, it is actually unconstitutional in Kentucky, because states have constitutions too, right? It is added to the amendment, so it is theoretically unconstitutional now to have gay marriage in Kentucky. Now, what somebody could do in federal court is challenge that, to say that law, because the next thing I want to talk about, actually go down, see what it says, a supremacy clause? It's a good transition. There is a clause in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause. If you remember from last year, the Supremacy Clause says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And by saying the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, it gives the federal government what's called inherent powers, right, or implied powers, that the federal government is a more powerful institution than the states. So, for instance, if the state of Kentucky passes a state constitutional amendment that says you can't have gay marriage, and if someone feels that's a violation of the U.S. Supreme Court, then the U.S. Constitution would trump the state constitution. Does that make sense? Because of the Supremacy Clause and what we call implied powers. So if someone brought to suit and challenge the Kentucky state constitution, they would have to do it in federal court. They could do it in state courts, right? We have tons of state. In fact, we have a state Supreme Court, right? We have state district courts, we have state court of appeals. They couldn't do it in state courts because it is literally unconstitutional in Kentucky to have gay marriage. And it's a problem because what's going to happen is people who are gay in Kentucky go get married in a state that allows for gay marriage and has rights, and comes back to Kentucky and they no longer have rights. And that becomes a commerce issue, so who knows what's going to happen. But they have already ruled that DOMA is unconstitutional.
They're like they go to a different state and then come back here, they're not technically married.
Right. And that's a problem, that's a legal problem. So the Supreme Court right now ruled very narrowly that states can decide on their own to allow for gay marriage, but they did not go so far to say that gay marriage is constitutional and everyone has to do it. They did not go that far. That's probably coming, but I don't know if the Supreme Court's ready yet. The Supreme Court has 9 people, obviously. Has 9 people. 5 of them are Republican nominees, 4 of them are Democrat nominees. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court is very polarized. What I mean is the 4 democratically appointed Supreme Court justices are very, very liberal. Obama's Supreme Court nominees, he's put 2 people in the Supreme Court. In fact, he's the only person to ever put 2 women in the Supreme Court. He put Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who's the first Hispanic person in the Supreme Court, and Elena Kagan. Justice Sotomayor is brilliant. They're all brilliant. But she's very, very liberal. Bush put 2 people in the Supreme Court, one of whom is exceedingly conservative. And there are already 2 other really conservative. So you have 4 very liberal people, 4 very conservative people, I should say 3 radically conservative people, 1 very conservative person, and 1 just pretty conservative. So the issue of gay marriage, if it is passed, will be passed on a narrow basis, sort of like DOMA. I don't think they would actually have a big, giant, widespread, everybody get married now, because that's not really where they're at, right? And since you're there forever, that's the thing. One of the Supreme Court justices, some of them are getting old, right? Like Ruth Bader Ginsburg is like 175 years old, and she's like this tall now, and she looks like a brilliant little raisin. But she's shriveled up. I mean, she's brilliant. But people are probably going to start pressuring her. Now that Obama won another election, she'd breathe a little bit easier because she's probably going to retire pretty soon, and he'll put on somebody else. Had a Republican won, she probably wouldn't have left, because she would have feared, had she left, a conservative would have put another conservative on the bench and would have swayed it to a more conservative bench.
It's good that it's like
Obama will put, well, not a Republican or a Democrat, but probably somebody that he has similar leanings towards, and Obama's relatively liberal, right? And Obama, if ever there was a president that knows what he's talking about with this, it's Obama. I mean, he was a constitutional law professor at the University of Chicago, which is the top 5 law school. So this guy knows what he's talking about, right? And he was editor of the Harvard Law Review. You know what that means? That means he was the best guy in Harvard Law School. So he's kind of a baller. So he knows what he's talking about. Yes.
But it's good to have like that equal separation.
It is good to have.
Because if you surround yourself with yes men, then
Well, it's not about yes men. If they don't, once they're on the Supreme Court, they don't answer to anybody. It's not about yes men. It's good to have a balance, because if you tilt it one way, then what happens is they make these decisions that America has to live with for the next 35 years, right? So you want to have some consternation, right? You want to have some people going back and forth with each other. And to be fair, 2 of them, one of the most conservative on the court is just mind-bogglingly brilliant. Anthony Scalia is brilliant. I've read some of his books before. He's great. And he makes very, very passionate arguments. I don't believe in any of them, but he's really smart, right? And so, I mean, he's good. And actually, Tiger, he has a son that's a priest. He has 9 kids. There's actually 6 Catholics on the Supreme Court right now. That's ridiculous. All right. Let's talk about the elastic clause, all right? The elastic clause is also, can you start and stop, please, Hannah? The elastic clause is going to be